Welcome to Recovering Evangelicals, a podcast for people who were once very comfortable in their Christian faith until the 21st century intruded and made it very hard to keep on believing. I'm Luke Jansen.
And I'm Boyd Blundell. We're in the middle of our Origin and Evolution of series of episodes, unpacking an idea that Chris Berger first introduced to us a year ago in episode 30, God creating a cosmic egg, which was intended to produce agape-capable beings. And over the past few weeks, we've talked about stellar evolution, chemical evolution, biological evolution. And we're now in that part of the story where agape-capable beings are starting to appear on the cosmic stage, humans. But they have to discover and develop this potential inside themselves. They have to evolve the cognitive and mental tools to have and display agape love. So at this stage, we've decided to bring back Jeff Schloss, who I believe it'll be 3 episodes ago, we had on, the Distinguished Professor of Biology and Walker Chair of Natural and Behavioral Sciences at Westmont College in Santa Barbara, California, and more notably for today, the author of The Believing Primate, Scientific, Philosophical, and Theological Reflections on the Origin of Religion from Oxford Press. Clearly the right expert for today's topic. Glad to have you back, Jeff.
Great to be with you.
And I'm so glad you come back as well, Jeff. Now, when we talk about the origin of something, it's often good to start from a time before either existed. So here today, we need to start from a time before morality or religion existed. The biological side of evolution begins roughly 4 billion years ago, and right from the beginning, there were 2 driving forces moving evolution along. But, I would argue, they were also the seeds of what would shape morality and religion. And these 2 forces were, in one sense, in opposition, pushing in opposite directions. And I'll start with the first driving force. Whether you're a theist or not, I think most would agree that the original bottom line rule was simple. Do whatever it takes to survive long enough to pass on your genes. It was a very selfishly oriented system. Think only about yourself, it's all about me, I'm number one. And that encouraged actions which were intended to guarantee that survival and flourishing. Things like steal and hoard resources from others if it helps you get ahead. Kill or be killed. Be as promiscuous and reproductive as possible to get the genes out there. And lastly, the other is a threat to your survival. Be fearful and defensive. This was the code that was ingrained into our fiber over the course of 4 billion years, and it's now behind all kinds of acts and behaviors that we would now call immoral. Things like murder, theft, rape, hate and fear, racism and tribalism. And even if you're a young earth creationist and want to take Genesis literally, there was only one commandment given to the original creation. Be fruitful and multiply. So Jeff, is this a good place to start? Is this a good summary of time zero? And is this one of the driving forces that started life going?
Wow, thank you for asking. And I would say, just being candid, yes and no. I might put it like this. If you take as the single driving force of evolution, replication and differential replication, some are going to do better than others. Darwin put it as survival of the fittest, although that phrase wasn't even actually his phrase. A single driving force, differential reproduction. But there's 2 ways of doing that, or really a continuum of ways. One way involves the struggle against others, basically competition. I try to get more resources than you. I try to get a mate ahead of you. I eat your babies. But the other way, and this is also part of natural selection, is cooperation, where in some situations you can have 2 individuals cooperating in ways that don't necessarily involve sacrifice, but involve mutual increase of one another's fitness. Just imagine 2 cold organisms, animals, mammals, huddling together. So Darwin himself, in The Origin, said the struggle for existence is not always against one another. Sometimes it is struggle with one another against other challenges. So you do have these 2 countervailing strategies, but I would say they're different means of achieving the same end, reproductive fitness. And in the public sphere, natural selection is often represented as only entailing the former, competition. My evolutionary biologist David Barish says, "What's in it for me" is an ancient refrain of all life. And George Williams, an esteemed evolutionary biologist, describes natural selection as a process for maximizing selfishness. Well, it is a process for maximizing reproductive output, but sometimes that can be attained by genuine cooperation.
So if we have this cooperation and selfishness, we'll call it right now, but also this cooperative, we can call it almost like an enlightened self-interest. And together with that driving force, Luke had mentioned earlier, there was a second one, pushing in the opposite direction, being other-oriented. And of course, what you've done in sort of complicating the question was talking about this natural cooperative with tribe that happens at all levels. Cells begin to learn the value of forming communities, specializing functions in communities, symbiosis, herd or pack mentality. And that's all that kind of adaptation that you were talking about. But then we start to see some individuals working to benefit other individuals that are not kin. So you've written a bit about this. Can you tell us a little bit about this emergence of like altruism with no gain obvious to you?
Yeah, boy, that's a great point. So the first thing I'd want to say is that even with cooperative alliances where there's mutual benefit, there's always the opportunity for defection. So if you give me a back rub and I give you one, well, shoot, after I've got mine, why give one to you?
Mm-hmm.
So the challenge at cooperation at every scale is to restrain defection. One way to do that is to just cooperate with your kin, because even if they defect, they have your genes. So if you construe natural selection as getting your genes effectively into the next generation, that's always going to help. The next step, as you just mentioned, is cooperating with folks who aren't your kin. And that makes sense if the cooperation is reciprocal. But once you have reciprocity, there's the danger of not getting your share back. And organisms keep track of one another. And if they get stiffed, and we've seen this in social creatures, if they get stiffed, they don't cooperate with that individual again. So the really distinctive things about human beings is this cooperating with kin and cooperating with those who help you, reciprocity, is widespread in the animal kingdom.
Yes.
Where humans are astonishingly unique, and actually I'm using here wording that's used in the scientific literature. Humans cooperate not just with their genetically related kin, and not just with a small circle of cooperators who they recognize and who they demonstrate to be faithful reciprocators. Humans cooperate at a much larger scale in social structures where they don't know the people. They're not related. They haven't cooperated before. That is widely regarded to be an astonishing outlier, to use a phrase from a recent paper on this.
Now, it's interesting, even on that point, on this whole cooperativity with unknown members of a similar species, humans are also known to operate in the complete opposite fashion. So, for example, this what we now see as tribalism and racism, I trace directly to this whole fear of the other. And that's something that goes back billions of years, this fear of the other. Anything that's not your kin and kind or even your species is dangerous, and you have to kill it before it kills you. So it goes both ways.
Absolutely. So the two things about cooperation in humans and in other species are, first of all, even within a group that's committed to cooperating and helping each other, there's always opportunity for defection. And that's true at every level, by the way. So individual cells in a body, they can defect. And it's called cancer, where a cell reproduces to its own benefit, unconstrained by the larger telos of the body. So you've got these two things at every scale of cooperation. You can have defection within the cooperative alliance. But of course, the flip side of this cooperative alliance is there's somebody outside the alliance. And in fact, often this is driven by competition between groups. So you're absolutely right. Sometimes you can have intensive in-group cooperation. And the flip side of it is out-group hostility.
Right.
Okay. The flip side of this sort of unique morality or this like astonishing outlier. First is, to what extent is that because we're an astonishing outlier in terms of intellect and imagination? And so that maybe animals tend to gravitate towards cooperation with the furthest thing that they can imagine affecting them. And since we can ecologically think that everything affects us, our cooperation would be larger. And then the other question is how the flip side of this works, which is our other kind of weird outlier. And is it an outlier, or is this kind of like just a myth, which is cruelty, which is something that seems pretty unique to humans.
Wow. That's a very astute point. Biologists themselves talk about that. Humans are unique insofar as they seem to manifest genuine altruism, or agape, which is helping one another at no benefit and even cost to oneself.
Mm-hmm.
But it looks like they're the only species that systematically evidence what behavioral ecologists call spite, which is hurting someone at greater cost to yourself. Predators hurt others all the time, and it helps them. Humans actually
hurt themselves to hurt someone else.
Revenge, for example, will hurt somebody at greater cost to themselves.
And it's important to say that that's a calculated thing. It's not just that the animal chooses to do something that hurts the other and hurts themselves, but they didn't know it. They didn't expect it. You're saying this is something where you go in knowing you're going to hurt yourself in the process, but so what?
Yep. Okay, so you were asking about the scale of human cooperation.
Sure, and whether that seeming like larger level outside of kith and kin cooperation could it be chalked up as just simply, we have a larger imagination, we have a larger view of what can affect us, and thus we include that in our calculations of what to cooperate with?
Well, what accounts for the larger scale of cooperation in human beings? And by the way, here it's important to distinguish between two dimensions of this. One is simply the scale of cooperation, of reciprocal helping one another. Humans do it at larger scales than any other creature, scales involving non-related individuals and people we don't know. But the other dimension is, however large the scale, there's the balance of the payoff matrix. Humans, too rarely, but we still do, cooperate and help others in ways that aren't reciprocal, in ways where we ended up giving more than we receive back. And biologists call this altruism. I think the biblical term for this is agape love. But those two things are different: the scale and the kind of the depth. So with respect to the scale, yeah, you mentioned, could imagination be part of that? Well, most folks that now think that the governing factor to increase the domain of cooperation beyond those that you have a history of face-to-face contact with is morality. And all the way back to Darwin, he thought that morality required two different faculties that were employed together. One was empathy. He called it sympathy, the capacity to feel with another. And the other was intellect, which enabled us to formulate and transmit moral norms. But yeah, I think you might consider that imagination. In fact, a number of ethical philosophers talk about the moral imagination, mm-hmm. how we're able to formulate increasingly inclusive and committed moral norms. So for sure, imagination is part of it, as is the basic capacity to understand, enter into, and care about the pain of others.
Jeff, you used that word transmit just a moment ago, the whole idea of transmitting or conveying ideas, in this case, moral truths, if you want to put it that way. And so another element that's got to factor into this increased ability for humans to cooperate would have to be language, that we evolved the ability to speak, and that allowed us not only to speak to other individuals, but also to cooperate with our ancestors. We could begin to transmit stories and learn from ancestors that are long dead.
That's a really good point. There's a really influential book from many years ago now called The Biology of Moral Systems by an evolutionary biologist named Richard Alexander. And he points out that one of the things, maybe the crucial thing that was instrumental in expanding the domain of human cooperation beyond those we know, is what he called indirect reciprocity. Direct reciprocity, I help you, Luke, because you've helped me before and I know you're a good guy. But what if I've never met Boyd and he's asking me for some help? And I don't know if he's just going to exploit me but if I've heard from Luke that Boyd's a good guy, well, then I'll help him. So in a sense, Luke's good behavior indirectly benefited him because his reputation was passed along to me as a good guy. So Alexander's notion of moral norms is that they function not just to internally constrain behavior, but to distribute the trustability of one another across large scales. Now, here's the bottom line to this, and it connects to your notion of language. That takes language. For somebody to have a reputation, we have to be able to talk about people. And the biologist David Haig at Harvard has a little quip, which I think is really interesting. He says, direct reciprocity takes a face. We have to be able to recognize each other. Indirect reciprocity takes a name. And so that would suggest that at least in terms of how we envision morality operating, it really is uniquely human. It takes language. It probably takes some other cognitive and affective capacities, like the capacity to feel guilt, that may also be uniquely human, but for sure, it takes language.
So we've been talking about the beginnings of an evolution of a morality. I want to talk about the evolution of a religion, but should we stop for a moment and call attention to this word morality? And you said, Jeff, that we need to define morality.
We often speak of morality like the evolution of morality, but we know that it contains so many different components. It for sure requires language. It requires the capacity to imbibe moral norms, to remember past actions. Then a radical cognitive capacity, which is to entertain a counterfactual. You can actually imagine that you could have chosen differently and then feel bad, feel guilty about it. So there's lots of aspects of morality. It's not just, it requires a lot of different human capacities.
Yeah, of course, the question of self and identity, right? Because it's like the whole face and name thing, that you need a face, you need a name, you need a memory, right? You need to have an identity that's consistent over a period of time that hangs together, where the Boyd that Luke would recommend to Jeff would be the same Boyd that Jeff would be interacting with.
Right.
And like that it's kind of underestimated just how complicated that is. That we do naturally, of just assuming that people's identities subsist over time.
Right. And you have the same assumptions about yourself. Otherwise, you wouldn't ever feel guilty, because that wasn't me doing it.
We try that, though, don't we?
Yes, we do.
That wasn't me.
Yeah.
So we've identified these two driving forces, the selfishness and the cooperativity, and altruism, and how these are working in opposite directions. And we talked about that in the context of morality. Let's talk a bit about the evolution of religion, the appearance of religion on this cosmic stage. Some anthropologists think they have evidence that Neanderthals and Stone Age humans had a belief in the afterlife. And we base that on the idea of, we look at how they buried some of their dead. Some biologists wonder if they see hints of religious thinking in certain animals. And we might get into some of that later on today. But roughly 50,000 years ago, we see humans making what looks like statues, presumably of divine beings, idols, and certainly evidence of a belief in an afterlife. We've heard over the last couple of weeks about humans originating and evolving and migrating out of Africa roughly 50 to 100,000 years ago. And as it turns out, their first steps out of Africa put them in the area we now call Egypt and Israel. And this is also where we see the first human civilizations and empires. We'll never know for sure exactly what those early immigrants thought and believed 50,000 years ago, but I think we can say a few things about the factors which typically shape human beliefs and which would have dictated what they focused their attention on. So we've heard of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You first need to take care of food and shelter and security before you devote time to things like building a religious system. And we know that throughout recorded human history that even those first basic needs get tied together with gods. So the gods of rain and sun, or the gods of success in hunting and war and reproduction. So maybe, Jeff, we could start there, talking about those early human immigrants 50,000 years ago in the vicinity of Egypt and Israel. But before we get to the Israelites and Judaism, what would those people have been thinking and as it began to evolve a religious system?
Yeah, that's such a fascinating question. And it's such a difficult question, since sometimes it's challenging to know what one another is thinking, just sitting face to face with one another, and to try to construct belief systems from artifacts in the past is very difficult. There's lots of debate over whether Neanderthals, for example, it seems clear they buried their dead. It's not clear whether that burial was ritualistic in the way that is very clear of Homo sapiens just a little bit after that, being buried with beads and valuable materials. But by the time of 10 to 50,000 years ago, it seems clear from artifacts that there was some sense of the transcendent. There were costly rituals associated with the transcendent. And so in addition to artifacts that suggest rituals, with living humans, we've seen a number of what look to be intrinsic cognitive dispositions. And it's difficult to imagine only arose within the last few thousand years. And this is interesting work because it seems to address the question of whether religion is purely a cultural invention that infects the human mind, or whether we have natural dispositions to formulate certain kinds of beliefs that are associated with religion. So one form of belief is belief in dualism, that there are aspects of being alive that transcend the death of the body. The psychologist Paul Bloom has written a fascinating book called Natural Born Dualists, and my colleague Jesse Bering has done experiments with children where he does a puppet show and he has a dragon eat a mouse. And then afterwards, he asks the children, is the mouse eating? And they'll say, no, the mouse is dead. Does the mouse miss its mommy? Yes, the mouse misses its mommy. That children, and by the way, this persists fairly late in development. Children tend to have a disposition to thinking that fundamental desires, although not biological behaviors, outlive the death of the body. And another one, a worker named Deb Kellerman has called children, particularly, but all humans, is promiscuous teleologists, that we're disposed to just assign an ultimate purpose to everything. She does work with children, and she asks, why are there rivers? So that we could have something to swim in. Why are there trees? So that monkeys could have something to climb in. And then lastly, a colleague of mine that I've worked on some projects with, named Justin Barrett, he's a cognitive scientist, and he was interested in whether this notion of supernatural powers, or like omniscience, is something that the children get trained into thinking, which was the prevailing view. And he's found in work with children that there's a native disposition to thinking that other intellects, my dog, my mom, know everything, and that they get educated out of thinking that. So at least these three notions of telos, or purpose, of dualism, and of supernatural qualities to agents seem to be something that we get taught out of, but are native dispositions. And by the way, in early religions, even those ones who weren't monotheistic, who didn't believe in some moral deity who made all these things, these three elements pervade what we view as earlier religions.
Right, and certainly that dualism is fundamental to so many religions. You have good, evil, right, wrong, spirit, body, life and death, God, humans, that sort of thing. And you also mentioned that one of the examples you mentioned was this persistence. The children have this idea of the persistence of those biological needs. Would that also tie into what we see in some religions, people needing to bring food, sacrificial foods to their ancestors, to feed their ancestors, that sort of thing. Is that a bit of a stretch?
Well, you're pushing me in my expertise here, but I would think yes, because what is notable about this kind of natural born dualism is that even little children don't attribute the persistence of biological needs. They ask, is the mouse thirsty? They'll say no. Does the mouse miss mommy? Yes. So in terms of bringing food,
Okay.
and it'd be good to get an anthropologist on, but there are other reasons one might do that, as an act of reverence, for example.
Okay. Now, I had asked, what can we say about their religion? And I said at that time that, yes, we can't know for sure what they believe, but I think we can take some good educated guesses. So, for example, they would have been very animistic. They also, I think, would have been very polytheistic. That's how religion would have started. All these different gods, gods for rain and sun, gods for war and for fertility and the grain, that sort of thing.
Based on our observations of religions amongst indigenous people, that seems justifiable. Even in Native American traditions, there were some monotheistic traditions as well. We're not sure when they arose. But yeah, and one other aspect that I would add to that is that in many of these religions, with many gods or other spirit forces, these were not viewed as moral beings who were intrinsically interested in the affairs of humans. They were powerful beings whose help could be enlisted, but they weren't seen as overarching moral deities who were concerned to guide and constrain goodness in human culture.
Now, in a previous conversation, we talked about, you mentioned the Axial Age. And for listeners, you can go back to a period like 1000 BC, 1000 to 600 BC, where what we consider now the major religions all find their roots. Just what's your take on this Axial Age as far as causality? Is it because we're getting organized into cities that we get more organized religions, or is it the other way around?
Yeah.
In your work, do you come across theories on that?
It's a really big deal right now, and there's lots of debate over it. I would push the Axial Age back a little further, and it looks like it emerged from the rise of agriculture and the carrying capacity for humans of any given size of land to increase. So you have an increase in human density, and then social structures regulating that density, the rise of cities and even ultimately states. What seems clear is that the origin of what some call the Axial Age religions is commensurate with this. And this would be the origin of monotheisms, moral deities interested in the affairs of human beings, but not just moral deities. In some of the Eastern religions that are non-theistic, there is nevertheless a moral structure to the world itself with its transcendent rewards through karma. And here's the debate. There's little debate about whether these religions coincided with the large-scale origin of big human cultures. The debate is which direction does the arrow of causality run? You have these large cultures, and then oftentimes with rulers informing or transforming people's view of how the supernatural realm runs. Shoot, if we have a king, maybe there's a king of everything. Or is the origin of moral deities, did it facilitate the origin or increase in scale of human societies? There's a series of papers just last couple of years on this. My own view is that it's both, but so you could say there's a positive feedback loop here. But I've been persuaded by the work of Ara Norenzayan and Joseph Bubulia, a number of colleagues who are not defending religion, but who argue that the arisal of moral deities facilitated and in fact was necessary to the large-scale increase of human social structure. So can we say why?
I think I know why. Because it's harder to rebel against the king if God said he should be king. In other words, it allows for a kind of stratification of social order that wouldn't be possible without a god, or without some sort of structure of that, like including karma. That would be one of my guesses. I haven't looked at this in forever.
Well, so it emerges theoretically out of the theories of morality that we were talking about earlier. If morality constrains defection, And a big way it does that is by negative reputational consequences. Alexander says that we all have a reputational bank account, and conscience prevents us from doing anything that would erode the capital in our reputational bank account. But the problem with morality is, as an indirect reciprocity, is it wouldn't constrain, at least in this vision of morality, it would constrain you from behaviors that wouldn't erode your reputational bank account. If you had no problem getting away with, that there's no chance you'd get caught. So what would really be good to sustain cooperation and restrain defection is a kind of moral overseer where you could never get away with it. He was incorruptible. He couldn't be bribed. He's omniscient. He saw everything. And, Voltaire said, if there were no God, we would have to invent him. And evolutionary accounts of religion have come around to that again, saying that this notion of an all-seeing, incorruptible moral being is extremely efficacious in sustaining large-scale human cooperation.
But did we invent God, or did we invent Santa Claus?
Yeah,
because that's kind of what you described.
Yeah, but the difference is this: aside from whether God was invented or not, we invent lots of beings and lots of weird supernatural beings. The question is Santa Claus an omniscient, incorruptible moral being whose vigilant focus is on each of us individually and doing everything he can to ensure that we're good and not bad? Now, if we invented any being like that, I think most people would call it God, and not Santa Claus or a leprechaun or something like that. In fact, the social psychologist I mentioned before, Justin Barrett, has an essay on the difference between God and Santa Claus.
Yes.
At some point, I think now's a good time, Jeff, that we talk about the purposes or the functions of religion. And I'd like the listeners just to get a sense of the scope of it. I can read off 8 functions that I've come across, or maybe you want to launch into your ideas before I put out the 8.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, so I'll just list them very briefly, just so, again, the listeners can get the scope. Religions where they provide explanations or answers, things that relieve cognitive dissonance. Religions diffuse anxiety and provide comfort in the face of a bad world. Religion's part of a mating recruitment or selection tool. They provide social cohesion. There's this interesting idea, the spandrel theory. We'll have to define what that means. A higher being is a natural extension of the social hierarchies in our world. We kind of alluded to that. And then lastly, there's Richard Dawkins' infamous idea that religion is a parasitic mimetic virus that infects us. So those are some of the ideas that I've come across in trying to find out what is the function and purpose of religion. Jeff, what are your thoughts?
Well, the first thing is those could all be true. Every one of them could be true. With any given religion, it could have multiple functions, and different religions could have different social impact. And then more than that, within any given religion, different adherents can reflect different fruits of their belief. I'll just give you one example. There's been a lot of work, and much of it not very good. Much of it is cohort studies where you just ask religious and non-religious people questions. But there have been some better work, which are longitudinal studies that track people through their life and changes in religious belief. But in any case, there's been a lot of work on religion and mental health. This notion of soothing anxiety, for example. Lots of data suggests that it's very efficacious in doing that. But recently, several studies have demonstrated that certain religious believers actually have worse mental health outcomes. And it's those believers, if they feel they're not living up to the expectations of religion, and if their concepts of God are stringently punishing.
None of our listeners, though. No one grew up with that. No one.
Yeah. So, I mean, the first thing I would say is all of the above. By the way, Dawkins' notion of a parasitic virus, he says, one of my favorite quotes of his, he says, religion is a virus more deadly than the smallpox virus, but more difficult to eradicate. So one problem with that, and actually any of these other ones is, so comment number 1, they can all exist. Comment number 2, for each one of them, it's not a binary. So Dan Dennett has taken a run at this too. And, to his credit, he doesn't start out with a conclusion that religion is destructive. But he says, let's put religion on the examining table and see whether it is or it isn't destructive. But that too is a naive binary. It depends what religion, in what context, with what disposition of an individual believer.
I admire your charitable interpretations, but no, he started with a conclusion.
Yeah. As I said that, yeah.
Yeah. He didn't know that the ball would roll off the table, but the table was tilted at like 45 degrees and it just did. It's just physics, I am interested a little bit in your take, because this is one of the first things that actually got me into this, was around the time of Gould and Eldridge's stuff on punctuated equilibrium, was the rise of spandrel theory.
Yeah.
And just for listeners who don't know, the reason spandrel was given as this name was because of architecture with church arches. And if you have two arches at right angles, there's a space in there that isn't supporting anything and doesn't need to be there. And it became this place where this beautiful artwork would start. And thus, there was no reason that space was built. It was just the space in the arches. And so evolutionary biologists started to use it as a way of, let's see how well it plays.
Yeah.
What does it describe in evolution?
Well, first of all, what Gould was doing there and Eldridge, they were tilting back against Darwinian fundamentalism. What they called Darwinian fundamentalism was the assertion that every major transmitted feature had to have an adaptive value. And then they went on to say they were just so stories where people just made up adaptive benefits for certain features. And they argued that, major features, many of them have to be selected for their utility, but other things, in addition to the word spandrel, we might just use the word byproduct. So here's an example. Your heart does have a function. It pumps your blood. But it also has sounds, lub-dub, lub-dub. Those sounds aren't an adaptation. Don't try to look for one. It's just a byproduct of something that has a different function. So when we get to religion, some people argue that religion is a byproduct of cognitive dispositions that have other functions. So I mentioned, for example, earlier, the attribution of livingness outside the body, dualism, or the attribution of, Deb Kellerman calls it promiscuous teleology. Well, what kind of adaptive value could those dispositions have? I'll take one example. How about just the attribution of agency to begin with, distinguishing between a dead object and a living one, or distinguishing between, you hear a rattle in the leaves, distinguishing between the likelihood that it's a snake and maybe it's just the wind. It would be of obvious evolutionary benefit to get it right. And now here it gets kind of interesting. We're never right all the time. So this involves an area called error management theory. And the suggestion has been that if we're going to be wrong, we better err in the direction of attributing agency when it's not there, as opposed to failing to attribute agency when it is there. Better to jump out of the way when a snake's not there than fail to jump out of the way when it is. And this actually has been given a name. Some people call it hyperactive agency detection. The original formulation was not hyperactive, but hypersensitive agency detection. Okay, that's an evolutionary benefit. But then we end up attributing these supernatural agents as just a byproduct of that. And there's no benefit.
So this is just the evolutionary road that ends up with Pascal's wager, right? It's better to believe and be wrong than to not believe in.
It is. Pascal's wager was one of the first implementations of error management theory, although in this case, it's better to be wrong about a snake, not God.
Yeah, but
yeah.
we're working right up. I mean,
Yeah,
Yeah.
right.
the snake's going to bite me. God's going to confine me to internal hell. So like it's just scale.
No, no. Well, in this case, Pascal's wager assumes if there is a God, I'm better off believing him.
Yes.
This was just saying, why would we even think there's such a thing as gods? It's because this hypersensitive agent, yeah.
Yes. If there is a snake, it's good to jump out of the way. Yeah.
Now, one last comment on this. The spandrel theory is often pitted against these different adaptive benefit stories, like it stabilizes cooperation or it relieves cognitive dissonance or stress. Spandrel theory is often pitted against that, but they don't have to be mutually exclusive. Evolution could have developed as a spandrel and then ended up having downstream benefits. And by the way, biologists call that exaptation, where a trait, where evolution finds a way of utilizing for benefit a trait that didn't have a benefit earlier on.
Okay, great stuff. We do have to move on, though. I have a couple more points I want to talk with you, Jeff. But here, the evolution of our moral and religious streak, it didn't stop. We've been building up moral codes and diverse religious systems ever since. One of those religious systems would be Judaism, which came out of that cultural incubator that we see in the Levant region, Israel and Egypt, where Babylon, for example, was the dominant religion at that time, and it grew out of this. We'll be talking about that in a lot more detail next week with an archaeologist based in Israel. But today we're focusing on evolution of a morality and a religious thinking in general. Many Christians will have this idea that God just dropped a whole moral code and religion on the nation of Israel at Mount Sinai, all packaged up with a bow wrapped up. But that moral code and religion had been evolving over millennia, and certainly Judaism may be where we first see the transition from polytheism to monotheism. And even that transition took the ancient Israelites 1,000 years to navigate, and they've been changing ever since. So let's first talk about that idea that Judaism evolved out of that region and changed over the course of thousands of years.
Yeah, I noticed you use the word evolved. The word itself, sometimes is used as a metaphor. It just means change over time. But a number of my colleagues in anthropology and evolutionary theory are talking quite literally about cultural evolution, about the driving forces can change the trajectories of cultural development in ways analogous to the evolution of biology. In particular, as genes change over time to increase reproductive success or survivability of the ones who bear them, so cultural ideas can change over time. They get transmitted in a way analogous to genetic transmission, and they can positively or negatively influence the endurability of the culture from which they emerge. And boy, some people might chafe at this, but I am inspired to see how some of the fundamental ideas and commitments have changed in the history of Judaism and Christianity over the last several thousand years. And here we don't have to make inferences from archaeological artifacts. It's there in written texts. Mm-hmm. So the idea of a monotheistic deity, a good creator of all things, seems fundamental and there from the beginning. The idea of rejecting human sacrifice appears early and appears to be a noted distinction between the Jewish tradition and surrounding cultures. But one thing that really has influenced me, and it relates profoundly to our earlier discussions of religion and social cohesion, is what appears to be views of revenge. So early on, you have Lamech's boast, where he boasts that he exacted revenge sevenfold. The man insulted him and he killed him. You go a little bit later and you have the notion of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. By the way, this is often cited as the ugly, vengeful posture of Old Testament religion, but actually at the time that was a restraint on revenge. It was something that promoted social cohesion by prohibiting this swashbuckling, perhaps sexual recruitment strategy of being the dominant male and killing the guy who calls you a name. And then you have the Old Testament prophet saying, vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. The idea of vengeance doesn't disappear, but that's not the human prerogative. That's a divine prerogative. And that we're invited to forgive those with whom we have social commerce. And then I'm both inspired and challenged by this one. By the time you get to Jesus, you have love your enemy, bless those who curse you, pray for those who despitefully use you. That's just not an extrapolation of the trends. That would be, to use the terms of my evolutionary colleagues, speaking of humans in general, that seems to be a spectacular outlier.
And we see the same trend, we won't talk about it today, but we see the same trend looking at some of the laws, for example, how an Israelite should sell his daughter into slavery or what they were to do with a raped woman. I've heard many times how they then dealt with it was an improvement over other societies around them, other cultures around them. So it was a change from their point of view, but then we've seen a change as well in more recent times. So there is this clear evolution in their moral codes. There was an evolution in their view in the afterlife. There was an evolution in their view on God himself. We're going to hear about that with Dr. Aaron Meyer. So clearly Judaism, it wasn't given to them by Yahweh as a package all ready to go. It was something that did evolve and continued to evolve over the 1,000 years that Israel was a nation.
Yeah, and what was the driving force of that evolution is an open question. So many believers call this expanding revelation. It wasn't just the moral imagination, but that God himself was guiding the understanding of a people. Aside from that, though, from our perspective, it looks like these changes constituted, to use Martin Luther King's notion, constituted an arc toward moral goodness. It seems like the boundaries of love were progressively expanded, and the expectations of willingness to invest in others were also expanded.
And it's important to note that we're also just talking about almost like a temporal evolution of morality, because in Judaism itself, in the Torah, it's also not a monolithic thing, right? It doesn't just develop over time, but even within any given time, there's lots of arguments. So that you have this vengeful God, but you also have, or this triumphalist writer in Chronicles, and then you have Hosea at the same time saying, God says, I desire mercy, not justice. Like this is not the same Jewish morality of the time of Moses or the time of David.
One of the things that we haven't talked about as we've been talking about religion, there's a lot of sociological work on religion that points out within any given religious community, there's a variety that is composed of people who jointly affirm the tenets of religious belief. There are different ways of affirming it. So a sociologist named Thomas Luckman speaks of what he calls the invisible religion, that some people claim adherence to the primary explicit goals of religion, but that's not actually what governs their priorities and behavior. And he calls that their true sacred values governing their behavior are hidden even to them. And some people argue that's when religious prophets stand up and say, hey, remember this. They get killed because they're confronting the invisible religion of the so-called believers.
Jeff, a moment ago, you were talking about progressive revelation, and one thing that I wanted to point out, that part of that progressive revelation isn't just they had more time to think about things, as if they were sitting out in the desert contemplating. Also, it was their interactions with other societies. And so, for example, it was in the Babylonian captivity where they were forced to re-examine, who were we? Who are we, these Israelites? Who are we? Where do we come from? Who is this God? That's also where they began to ask new questions when they encountered the Zoroastrian Empire, the Persians, Daniel in Persia, and completely re-examined the afterlife. And then when the Jewish nation, the nation of Israel, encountered the Greeks, Hellenic Greeks, and they completely reevaluated so many things that eventually became Christianity. So it's not just that they had more time, but also they encountered other societies, other cultures, and that was part of the progressive revelation, I would argue.
Yeah, I would think that there are multiple streams. For sure, it's not just time, kind of building the scaffold of religious beliefs, but it's encountering other cultures. It's also encountering new challenges and scales of structure within your own culture. And it may be, if in fact the object of religious belief, a good and caring and wise God is indeed accessible, it may be changes in the human persona that occur as a result of commerce with this God.
Right. So some of our listeners might be scandalized by this, thinking, what do you mean? It changed? Our belief system changed? They might be scandalized by this thinking. So here's the question I want to explore now with you, Jeff. Having an explanation, having an evolutionary explanation for morality and religion doesn't mean that we can now dismiss both as simply an evolutionary adaptation. I think that's what philosophers would call the genetic fallacy. I heard in one of your presentations you talked about Richard Joyce and the belief pill, and I think this certainly is relevant to this.
Yeah, this is a serious question that's being raised by a number of philosophers mostly, called Darwinian debunking arguments. And it goes like this. It does not argue that the object of religious or moral beliefs is false. It argues it very well may be true, but we have no warrant for believing it's true. And here's why. Imagine you took a pill that caused you to believe that Napoleon lost at Waterloo. And you know that that pill has that effect, and you know you took it. Now, by the way, Napoleon did lose at Waterloo.
He did lose, yes.
But if you took that pill and you know it has that effect, you have no grounds for believing he lost at Waterloo, because what you do know is the reason you believe it is you took a pill. If I didn't take the pill, then, and I believe, I might do so on the basis of rational evidence. You took a pill that made you believe in it. So it's the belief pill criticism. Another way of putting it is, if the cause of your belief in something isn't materially related to the truth of what you believe in, well, it may be true, but you don't have any justification for believing it's true.
Okay, so I'm using this as an on-ramp. And so this is actually what got me out of philosophy into theology originally, which is I wrote a whole paper on the true justified belief argument as the definition of knowledge in Russell. And I've not left that paper. I didn't do that well at that paper. My professor was not very happy with what I was saying. But just simply that the words, the way analytic philosophers use the word justified and use the word warranted is, to me, it's baffling that they continue to get away with it. Because these have such a sort of common sense, real, what a normal person would think justified. It's such a fuzzy criteria that I can't. I mean, these kind of examples actually kind of like really get me going, because I'm like, how can you say that? How in the age of post-Freud and Jung can you think you know why you believe anything?
Right.
Why are you so convinced that these steps are so easy to track for warrant?
So one of the things about this, the Darwinian debunking arguments, is they actually sidestep all the debate on what constitutes a justified or warranted belief. They're not doing it because they're being sloppy. Mm-hmm. They're just saying this. At the very least, we would say a belief is warranted if it in some way tracks the truth or the falsity of the object of belief. So
I'm not gonna take us too far off on this tangent.
So unlike our belief that a tiger is out there, mm-hmm. The way evolution works is we would expect evolution to generate some sort of connection between belief in the tiger and whether or not it's actually there. If I'm running away from things that aren't there at all, that doesn't make any sense. It doesn't help me. But now let's get back to religion and morality. If the adaptationist views of religion and morality are true, and that both moral beliefs and religious beliefs actually help us, well, they would help us whether or not they were true. So the debunking arguments just say this: we don't know whether they're true or not, but they would help us, and therefore we're disposed to having them, even if they're false. So if you can demonstrate that you'd be disposed to having a belief independent of its truth or falsity, setting aside debates over what constitutes warrant, that would seem to be unwarranted. You will hold a belief independent of whether it's true or false. So my response to that is, I actually think on the face of it, it's a good argument. that there's one scientific and one quasi-epistemological problem. The scientific one is just this. I don't mean to be snarky, but dream on. Natural selection is not a belief pill. We do not have an explanation of morality or religion that is sufficiently concrete and widely accepted as to be able to claim natural selection is a pill that makes you believe these things. We didn't get into it, but within the realm of morality, everybody's looking to demonstrate that morality is an outcome of evolution and therefore it must have emerged by natural selection. But there are at least half a dozen completely different proposals involving group selection or individual selection, involving indirect reciprocity, like we mentioned before, or costly signaling. A lot of different accounts. There is no belief pill. So I would say Joyce is just starting with the pre-commitment that, yeah, natural selection caused this, but we don't have an account. So if we get a belief pill, let me know. But we're not there yet. The other one is, I mean, this gets a little fuzzy, but yes, if there's a belief pill that caused you to believe in Napoleon, and you knew it did it, and you knew you took it, maybe your belief that Napoleon lost at Waterloo wouldn't be warranted. But what if there was other evidence that Napoleon concocted the pill? That it was made from vegetation that was found only on the island of Elba. And we could actually trace back to export data from shipping logs. And what if there was evidence that Napoleon concocted the pill? So that raises the question of, are there other kinds of evidentiary route to the existence of God? And in fact, could God have so constructed us to flourish when we believe in him? So that's a line of thinking that a number of people are exploring now, not just theistic believers, by the way.
Wow, that's fascinating. We're getting close to, we're at the end of time. Is there anything that we haven't covered, Jeff, that you'd like us to cover?
Well, we talked about this last time, so maybe there's no reason, but the one little snippet that is both theologically salient and also a launch to both morality and religion is the notion of a progressive series of evolutionary transitions in cooperative interdependence. And that secular biologists have said that humans are, in a sense, the apex of this, but we're not all the way there. We're stuck in a transition, and we're not cells in a body because we still have ourselves. And so many people think that morality and religion are solutions to that. And as a Christian, I find it really interesting that we're disposed for agape love to be our fulfillment, but we're not entirely equipped to do it. We need morality and religion, and as a Christian, I would say grace.
Anything else before we go?
No, I've really enjoyed talking with you guys.
All right. Okay, so then we should probably draw a line under this. There's a lot of stuff in here. The one thing we can see in all of this discussion is that human thinking on matters which eventually became our morality and religion, that thinking has been evolving over many tens of thousands of years. It's been changing ever since, and over the next few weeks, we'll be focusing specifically on the evolution of religious thinking that's particularly relevant to our listeners, Judaism and Christianity, and the evolution of the holy writings of those two religions. So tune in next week for that. But Jeff, thanks for coming this week. It's really been great. We've already heard about the projects you've got in the pipeline. I won't ask that again. And again, we'll leave links in the show notes for that. I expect totally we'll be bringing you on for another podcast in the future, and I so look forward to that. So thanks for coming on to the show.
Great to be with you. I have to say this hour with you was just fun and stimulating. So even if we don't do another show, I hope we get to have a cup of coffee or a beer sometime.
Absolutely.
I'm all for it.
Next week, we're going to hear from Dr. Aaron Mayer, a paleoarchaeologist working in the sands around Israel, digging up evidence for the origin and evolution of the nation of Israel and of Judaism itself. Till then,
thanks for listening.
You've been listening to Recovering Evangelicals with Luke Jansen and Boyd Blundell. Send your comments, questions, and suggestions for new episodes to lukejjansen@gmail.com Join our private discussion group on Facebook by searching for the Recovering Evangelicals podcast group. Look for the logo that you always see at your favorite podcast catcher and ask to be let in. Subscribe to lukejjansen.wordpress.com if you want to get advanced releases and group posts, or browse through our archive for a full listing of all our previous episodes. And please help this podcast by sharing with a friend and leaving a review rating at your favorite podcast catcher.